Good evening, and welcome to the first lecture of the 2021 Field Archaeology Series on Thursday, or FAST. My name is Buck Robertson, and I am this year's FAST coordinator. Every month, FAST features a public-facing lecture presenting the latest in archaeological research from the University of Michigan students, faculty, and researchers. FAST is generously supported by the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, the Department of Classical Studies, and the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology, or IPCAAA. But FAST is ultimately made possible by an eager and engaged audience of world-class speakers. Before I begin, I would like to thank everyone in attendance, both those in person and virtually. The past year and a half has made many aspects of life more complicated, and this series is certainly no exception. To my knowledge, this is the first time FAST has been held as a hybrid lecture, and I would like to thank each one of you for your attendance in these circumstances and ask your patience in the event of any complications that may arise. If you are tuning in virtually, I would like to remind you to remain muted for the duration of the lecture, although we will welcome questions at the end of our talk. I also would like to thank my assistant coordinators, Caroline Everts and Abigail Staub, they're at the back, I'll sign people in, for their help in making this event happen, as well as today's speaker, who has been active and interested in ensuring that FAST remains vibrant this year. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this year's first FAST speaker, Dr. Chris Ratté. Dr. Ratté is a professor in the departments of classical studies and the history of art here at the University of Michigan, as well as a core faculty member of the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology, IPCAAA. He specializes in the archaeology of Western Turkey, with research focusing on the role played by the built environment in the articulation of social and cultural identity, especially in regions on the peripheries of the Greek and Roman worlds. His lecture today is entitled The Archaeology of Western Anatolia, circa 1200 to 133 BCE. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Ratté.
Thank you, Buck. I want to start by asking whether the people in the room would prefer that I keep the mask on or take the mask off. I noticed that Barbara Graziosi in her lecture yesterday took her mask off, and it was nice to be able to see her lips moving. On the other hand, if anyone's uncomfortable with that, I'm happy to keep it on. Okay, I'll take it off then. So the subject of the lecture is the title of a book that I'm hoping to write in the next couple of years. And so I thought I would try it out on you, give you a kind of an overview of the book, but also talk about it conceptually and talk about some of the challenges that confront somebody trying to write a book about the archaeology of Western Anatolia. Challenges in defining the subject, both in space and in time. Doesn't seem to be going forward. Oh, there we go. So I want to join the distinguished company of my colleagues in writing a book of this nature, which I have never done before. It has this is in response to a solicitation from the Cambridge University Press, which came my way a few years ago, and I never got around to writing the proposal until now. And I'm planning to be on sabbatical next year, and then I'm planning to write the book. And the subject is the one that I have been working on for decades, which is the archaeology of Western Anatolia. It's interestingly different from the archaeology of Greece and the archaeology of Italy. And I'll try to suggest one of the ways it's different by looking initially not at the past, but at the present. So this is a picture of refugees who were crossing from Turkey to Greece in 2016. So that was 5 years ago, but the problem is not over. There are still people making this crossing, and the refugees in their thousands who made it from Turkey to Greece in 2015, 2016, many of them are still pretty much stuck where they landed. So in large refugee camps on Lesbos, on Chios and Samos, the other islands off the coast of Greece. And in many ways, I think you could say that Europe is undergoing a process of definition in these waters by this experience. The way that the countries of Europe, of Western Europe, have responded to this refugee crisis says a lot about what Europe is today. That's the way we read about it in the press, right? When we read about Angela Merkel and saying "Wir schaffen das," and then all of the political problems that ensued for her. But it's the same is true if you look at it on the Turkish side. So the way that Tayyip Erdogan has dealt with this crisis is remaking Turkey's place in the Middle East. So what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Europe, what kinds of entities are coming into being right now, in many ways comes into very, very sharp focus when you look at the region that I'm looking at in this book. That is to say, the western coast of modern Turkey. It's a commonplace to say that Anatolia, Asia Minor, Turkey is a bridge between the Middle East and Europe. That all books on the subject start by saying this. They say this in the first preface, and then they generally tend to just pass on and not say very much more about it. And what I think gives the way I've defined the subject coherence is a focus on this issue, on the status of this region as a frontier zone, as a borderland, geographical and cultural, in ways that are true today, but interestingly in ways that were true thousands of years ago as well. So that's an argument for looking at this region the way I propose to do it, but there are arguments made against it too. It's interesting that this book hasn't been written before, and there are reasons for that. So these are two general treatments of the subject. One is a kind of a textbook, sort of like the book that I'm hoping to write. The other is one of these, many, many handbooks and companions that have come out in the last couple of decades. They both go down to the period of the Persian conquest and not later than that. And they both pay the vast, even when they get to the Iron Age, they concentrate almost exclusively on Central and Eastern Anatolia. They look at Western Anatolia too, but not so much at the coast. And the reason they don't look at the coast is because the coast was inhabited from the early first millennium BC onwards by people who lived in communities that self-identified as Greek. So most treatments of the archaeology of Anatolia, the archaeology of Turkey, have focused on the cultures that are exclusive to Anatolia, that are considered to be indigenous to Anatolia, and treated the Greek communities on the Western coast as really belonging to a different subject. Now, I want to do both. I want to look and I want to see these Greek communities as indigenous to Western Anatolia in the same way that the societies of Central Anatolia were, or not in the same way, but in a way parallel to the experience of the communities of Central Anatolia. That's one thing that is not usually done. And the other thing I want to do is take the subject past the Persian conquest, which is the mid 6th century BC, mid first millennium BC, down through the Hellenistic period. So 133 BC is the date of the so-called bequest of Attalus, when the last of the kings of Pergamon, the great power of Western Anatolia in the Hellenistic period, bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. And shortly after, this whole region became the Roman province of Asia. So that's my stopping point. Now, I've shopped my book proposal around to people, and some have said you need to stop earlier, and others have said you need to go later. You should go down, let's say, to the time of Augustus, or you should stop with Alexander the Great. So what I want to do in the next, now that I've spent like 10 minutes giving you the introduction, the next 40 minutes is to kind of, as I say, present the book to you in outline and show you pictures, asking you to think with me about whether these definitions work. Does this definition in space and does this definition in time, does it make a coherent story? And I hope we'll come back to that in the discussion. So just a few words on some major themes. You can pass over that. I was gonna say, if you're writing a book on the archaeology of Greece, or if you're writing a book on the archaeology of Italy, in a sense, it's an easier subject. So if it's Greece, you're looking at a defined geographical unit. You're looking at a defined population. The population basically fills up the unit. So the people who live there all adopt the same culture. They speak the same language. They worship the same gods. Although they live in independent communities, their social institutions are connected with each other. And you can tell the story down until the time of Alexander the Great, when Greece expands hugely, and that's when most treatments of the subject end. It's a big lost opportunity in my view, because the Hellenistic period is really, in many ways, been the focus of much of the most exciting research in Greek archaeology in recent decades. But I understand the logic, and a similar logic obtains when you come to Italy, but it just doesn't work with Turkey. Turkey is much more fragmented. There are these different cultures, and the key thing is that one of them overlaps with this other cultural zone. So I'm going to read to you a little bit of my long proposal. I won't give you the whole thing. I could read it all to you. It would take longer than the amount of time available to me, so I will refrain from doing that. But here's the key paragraph, which is kind of summarized on this slide. The book, writing in this sort of future present. The book is based on the premise that its subject, defined and treated in this fashion, forms a coherent whole. The complex history of this region cannot be reduced to a linear pattern of development or a master narrative, but it does exhibit certain recurrent themes that tie the disparate subregions examined here together, including, and then these are the themes: mobility, urbanism, state and identity formation, empire. And it argues that in many periods of antiquity as today, Western Anatolia constituted a borderland between cultural and geographic areas with profound consequences for the human societies that inhabited the region. In addition, study of Western Anatolia is complicated and enriched by the fact that it crosses the boundaries between classical and Near Eastern archaeology, between history and proto-history, and that it requires scholars to reconcile the often apparently conflicting evidence of physical realia and written text. This is true of all classical archaeology, but it's especially true of this particular region. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, so those are some basic themes, and I'll try to say what I mean by them as we go through these chapters. Somehow, can we get rid of that? Oh, sorry. Can we get rid of the ribbon at the bottom so that people can see chapter 10 and conclusion? All right. So there we go. Okay. So, I'm using the term Anatolia. That's a Greek word for describing this region. There were many different population groups, all of whom spoke different languages. So we can't say the inhabitants of this place called it one thing or another. So we use the Greek term. We could use the the Latin term Asia Minor, but I'm using the Greek term because that's the term that Turkish scholars and use and Turkish students use. So that's the Anadolu is the Turkish equivalent. And when I say Western Asia Minor, I mean basically from this region, Western Anatolia, the center of the peninsula of Asia Minor to the coast. So this is the modern capital of Ankara, and the first major site that we're going to look at is Gordion here. And the way I'm thinking of organizing this book is basically through case studies. So extended examination of a series of key sites, contextualized within larger regions, but with a focus on key sites. And the idea is to start with Troy. And by the way, I don't think there's anyone in this room who has taken my class on the archaeology of Anatolia. Is there? Did you take it? Oh, you guys took it. Okay. So you have heard in many ways, this book is a distillation. I've kind of been practicing it for about 15 years now in teaching this course. So in many ways, it's a distillation of what I did in that class, and I want to write it in part because it doesn't exist, and if it did exist, it would be a lot easier for me and other people like me to teach classes like this. So it'll be kind of familiar to you. So it starts with Troy and a brief introduction to the Bronze Age background of Anatolia, and tells very briefly the story of the collapse of the whole world system that tied the Eastern Mediterranean region together in the late Bronze Age, and that justifies basically starting at that point, because the collapse of this world system was followed by sort of radical reduction in social complexity, followed then by the resurgence of a number of different complex societies, especially, throughout the region, but I'm focusing obviously on the ones in this big peninsula. So the Bronze Age chapter kind of sets the stage. It's by no means a full treatment of late Bronze Age Anatolia. It's basically focusing on Troy and Hattusha. And the Troy part provides a way of talking about basic concepts of archaeology like stratigraphy and new methodological advances like geophysical prospection. It introduces people to a pretty spectacular site. The history of excavation there, which encompasses in many ways the history of archaeology in Turkey, since the excavations of Heinrich Schliemann at Troy were among the earliest scientific excavations carried out in this region, and ends by looking at the construction of a new museum on the site, and talking a little bit about the role of archaeology in cultural heritage management and contemporary cultural identity creation formation in Turkey. So situates the practice of archaeology in part in relation to the current nation state. And I plan to conclude this introductory section by saying a little bit about the idea first proposed by Manfred Korfmann, but developed by Brian Rose, that the whole Trojan War story was created in response to the archaeological evidence of this complex society in this region. That the story arises out of the ways that local populations in the Iron Age understood, explained, related to themselves created a kind of cultural memory in response to these impressive monuments of an earlier civilization. That's not the whole story, obviously, but I think or I'm persuaded by the argument that's an important part of the story. So that's how to introduce this interesting relationship between, as I say, text and physical realia. Then we go to Gordian. So Gordian and Phrygia are the, Gordian is the central or the best known archaeological site in the region called Phrygia, which is the home of the first complex society to come into being in Anatolia after the late Bronze Age collapse. And it's the first site and the first culture to introduce what I identified as one of the major themes, which is mobility, because according to Greek historians, the Phrygians, the inhabitants of this region, were migrants who came from Thrace, so from Europe, across the Bosphorus and into Anatolia after the end of the Bronze Age. Their language is in Indo-European language. It was a written language, at least as early as the 8th century BC. The alphabet is close to the Greek alphabet, also based on the Phoenician alphabet. And in this, the Phrygians are similar to all of the other cultures that will be the main focus of the first part of this book. So Phrygia, Lydia, Ionia, Caria, Licia. These are all distinct cultural regions, but their inhabitants all spoke Indo-European languages, and they all had, and their languages were all written languages. I'm sorry, I'm walking away from those of you who are watching remotely. Sorry, I forgot about that. They're all written languages, and they all use alphabetic scripts. Most scholars, I think, still believe that they derive their scripts in every case from Greek, but there is a strong group of specialists in Phrygian who think that the Phrygian borrowing from Phoenician was independent of the Greek. So the site of Gordian is a classic Middle Eastern tell site. It was excavated, has been excavated always by classical archaeologists who come here because Herodotus tells us that Midas, the king of Phrygia, was the first of the barbarians to make dedications at Greek sanctuaries. So it was the first non-Greek, as it were, to establish diplomatic relations with the Greeks. But as one of the former directors of Gordian pointed out to me once when I was visiting there, in many ways, classicists are ill-prepared to excavate this site, which is has much more in common in terms of its archaeology with tell sites in Mesopotamia than it does with the kind of site that classical archaeologists are accustomed to digging. Anyway, excavations have been continuous there for more than half a century, since the early 1950s. The tell has been excavated. This huge tumulus tomb has been explored. The discovery of the tomb inside this tumulus is one of the great adventure stories of mid-20th century classical archaeology. Here's a view inside the tomb. It's the oldest large wooden structure in the world. It's a remarkable monument. These are the bronze cauldrons, some made locally, others imported from the Near East, that were found when the tomb was first entered. And all kinds of interesting work has been done on the artifacts from this tomb, including being able to make a chemical analysis of the mead, of which the residue was found inside this vessel, providing a recipe which is now, you can buy it in Whole Foods Market, a beer produced by a craft brewery in Pennsylvania. Now, as I said, Gordian is the best known site in Phrygia. It's usually perceived as the capital of a unified territorial monarchy, a territorial kingdom, encompassing a large region. And as such, it's considered to provide a kind of a prototype for later principalities, territorial monarchies in other parts of Anatolia, such as Lydia, Caria, Licia. And this is a compelling idea, but it's also one that has been questioned recently by archaeologists looking at other equally large tell sites around Phrygia, at Ankara, for example, the modern capital, at Kaman Kalahiyuk, here on the eastern part of central Phrygia. And the investigators at these sites have suggested, well, perhaps Phrygia is less like one of these Near Eastern imperial states than we imagine, and more like Greece, more a cultural zone inhabited by communities living in peer polities, as it were. So that's an interesting line of research, and it has been given special interest by, or special kind of spice by the discovery. I'm not doing that. Sorry. By the discovery since the early 1990s of a huge known but never previously investigated archaeological site east of Ankara at this place called Kerkenesta, and here's a view of its fortifications. And found at Kerkenesta was not only a remarkable site, but an interesting array of artifacts, including objects with Phrygian inscriptions. So research at places like Kerkenes, like Kaman Kalahiyuk, like Ankara are calling into question, the research at these sites is calling into question the model of Phrygian monarchy that has obtained until now. A much more recent, very interesting discovery that is an inscription that documents conflict between Phrygia and one of the so-called Neo-Hittite states of southeastern Anatolia. Another question that I'm just not going to get into in this class is it legitimate to leave out the Iron Age cultures of Eastern Anatolia, of ancient Urartu, Armenia, and the so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms? And one of the reasons I think you can do that, to come back to the linguistic argument, is that these regions have much greater continuity with the Bronze Age than the region we're looking at. And evidence of the fact is they continue to use Bronze Age writing systems, cuneiform or hieroglyphic Luwian, as in the case here. So the next cultural zone is Lydia, and that's here. But before going to look at the evolution of the kingdom of Lydia, that there's an intervening chapter that introduces readers to the archaeology of all of Western Anatolia, both Lydia and Ionia, in the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. So this is a view from Sardis, we'll come back to this, the capital of Lydia, looking across the plain of the Hermus River. This is the tomb of one of the great kings of Lydia, Aliates. And around the banks, the shores of this river, of this lake, beginning in 2004, a team of researchers led by Chris Roosevelt of Boston University, now Koç University in Istanbul, have found a series of Bronze Age citadels that seem to be the centers of administration of one of the local kingdoms mentioned in Hittite texts that dominated this region in late Bronze Age. And here's one of these sites in an Google Earth view, you can see the outlines of its fortifications, outer fortifications, inner fortifications, inner fortifications, and excavations on the site of those inner fortifications. I took this picture in 2016 when they had just uncovered what are a series of storage pits. And that is so they were kind of hoping for archives with cuneiform tablets in a kind of palace complex. And what they found were a series of effectively granaries. So very, very secure storage of foodstuffs. That's the whole purpose of this multi-fortified enclosure, which tells us interesting things about late Bronze Age society in this region. Now, after the Bronze Age collapse, the thing that we know most about Western Anatolia is that a number of Greek communities came into being on the coast. And this is the story of how this happened is told to us by a succession of Greek historians, from Herodotus down to Strabo, and Pausanias actually provides the 2nd century AD Roman travel writer who was from this region. He provides the fullest account. And basically what we're told is that there was a mass migration after the collapse of Mycenaean society in Greece, a mass migration across the Aegean Sea to Ionia. And this is the story that I learned, and that I was never encouraged to question when I started studying the subject, decades ago. It's a major subject of current research, and to give kind of extreme views, one is that there was this invasion and population replacement, basically. So you had a bunch of Greeks who come across the sea, displace the indigenous population, and establish footholds, colonial footholds on this territory. The other extreme is, well, there were people moving around all the time. So this place did not have, after the end of the Hittite Empire, a very well-defined cultural identity. And what happened was that the indigenous, local inhabitants of this region, in the course of the early 1st millennium BC, decided to self-identify as Greek, decided that of the possible cultural identities that they could adopt, Greek language, Greek social organization, and so on, was most advantageous to them. So it's not a question of population change as simply the adoption of a new identity, in which and here's how I am bringing in one of the major themes of the book, which is urbanism, in which the conflict and the change was in many ways more between emerging urban communities and rural populations than it was between different ethnic groups. So it's not that Greeks came in and formed cities and oppressed the local indigenous population, but rather that the local population separated into two groups, one adopting an urban lifestyle, the other maintaining rural lifestyles. The urban lifestyle affiliated more closely with the Greek world, and that there was certainly conflict, and in some cases clearly violent conflict, but it was not so much between different population groups, but between different social groupings within the same population. So that's a really interesting debate. Okay, on to Lydia. So Lydia is but here's the other part of this story that's really important to me, that I neglected to highlight, but I want to highlight now. So you have this coastal region. On the one hand is the sea. On the other hand is the Anatolian interior. And in Lydia, this very fertile river valley just in from the coast, a powerful society is taking form. And that society, in many ways, seems to be modeled after or to be developing out of the model established by Phrygia. So if you live on the coast, you're eventually, over the course of the first millennium, you're finding yourself squeezed between two powerful emerging societies: Greece to the west and Lydia to the east. And you have links to both groups. You could be Lydian, you could be Greek. And in a sense, what happens is the whole the whole coastal region, all this network of communities adopting Greek, emphasizing Greek identity. The point I'm trying to make here, and this is something that I don't think most historians of this region do, is that the formation of Ionian identity took place in many ways in response to Lydian state formation, to the growth of the Lydian kingdom. Okay, so just a few words on Lydia. So Lydia it's unusual in that there's that broad plain. I showed you a picture of it before, well watered. So it's still the most fertile, one of the most fertile regions of the sort of breadbasket of Western Anatolia. And it's dominated by a single site. So in this respect, it conforms to the model that we used to think obtained in Phrygia. Clearly does obtain, however, in Lydia. There's one great big urban site, and there is no other site of comparable character anywhere else in the large territory of Lydia until the Hellenistic period. And here's a view of Sardis, a plan of it. It's about 200 hectares in area, surrounded by massive fortification walls. And I'll just say three things about research there. So early research found a gold refinery where interesting technologies for separating gold from separating the gold from the silver in naturally occurring electrum were first invented. And that led to the development of the world's first coinage. So that's over here at 10. Huge fortifications were explored in the 1980s and 90s. And the Persian destruction level, burying beneath it houses full of artifacts. So a really important fixed point in chronology. Ancient chronology hadn't been fully published yet, so its significance hasn't yet been incorporated into our knowledge of the ancient world. And current excavations here at 23 and 68 that are uncovering the palace, apparently, of the Lydian kings and showing that this kingdom was actually quite a bit older than our Greek sources give us to believe. So it goes back to the 8th century, overlaps in interesting ways with Phrygia. So doesn't look very good now, but it was at least conserved. After excavations in the 1960s, the Lydian gold refinery, cementation furnaces, early Lydian coins. The fortification wall discovered, I mean, this picture was taken in 1980 after this wall was first uncovered. It's a detail of this portion right here. It was buried beneath its own debris. The lower part of the wall was buried beneath the debris of the upper part of the wall when the fortifications were overthrown by the Persians, when they attacked Sardis and conquered all of Anatolia in the mid-6th century, burying houses at the foot of the wall, which were abandoned in great haste, not entirely abandoned. Some of the occupants of the houses were found also buried beneath the debris when the Persians came. And then up here, as I said before, is the focus of current excavations. So going on like last year, in the picture, it's this flat-topped hill that projects from the lower slopes of the Acropolis, which together with this flat-topped hill next to it, seems to have been crowned by a huge palace complex, comparable in size, for those of you who know it, with the Assyrian palace at Khorsabad, basically the same scale. And here are excavations. So this is just from this last season at that site. Okay, so we're about halfway through, and I have 17 more minutes now, 17 more minutes, so I'll speed up. So now we're going to look at the cities, the Greek city-states. And I don't have to say it much now. I already introduced the basic, historical problems of the so-called Ionian migration. It's partly an issue. I mean, why not just believe what Herodotus and all these others historians tell us? Well, because the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to bear it out. So the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to be consistent with this view. So you have to think to yourself, well, why would the historians say it and clearly believe it if it wasn't true? And the answer is, well, it was both true and untrue in complicated ways. The principal site of Ionia, so the Greek region of the coast, was Miletus. Recent excavations at Miletus and recent study of artifacts at Miletus have shown us, and the pottery is of particular interest, have shown us that, have given us a lot more information about the production and circulation, production and consumption of East Greek pottery than we had before, showing that it was basically that it was really concentrated in one production area, which was Miletus and its territory. So it changes our view of the Ionian economy. The other big site of Ionia is Ephesus, and there has been interesting research on early Ephesus. I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to say a little bit about the biggest monument of the archaic, so the early city, which was its colossal temple of Artemis, of which only one column of the successor building survives in situ, but which was first explored by British archaeologists in the 18th century and then by Austrians from the late 19th century to the present day. And the interesting thing about this building is that we know both from texts and from archaeology that it was financed by the king of Lydia, by Croesus, the most famous, the fabulously rich king of Lydia. And it documents close interaction between Lydia and Ionia in this period. I'm just going to show you a picture from one other Ionian site. This is Phocaea, and an interesting recent discovery there is of fortifications that seem to have been built during the period of Lydian domination, but in advance of the Persian invasion. The inhabitants of Phocaea, by the way, when the Persians conquered Anatolia, up and left and relocated, according to our sources, to southern France. So simply just engaged in the kind of mass refugee movement that our sources often talk about. Of course, the archaeology shows that they didn't all leave. The city continued to be inhabited. So I've been referring, on and off to the Persian conquest. And for those of you who don't already know the history of Anatolia, I need to make it clear that Lydia grew to be a very, very powerful kingdom, controlling the entire region that is the subject of this proposed book in the course of the late 7th and early 6th century. More or less at the same time that Persia, so the inhabitants of this peripheral region on the eastern edge of the Near Eastern world, conquered Assyria and created a big new empire. So you have Persia on the eastern edge of the Near Eastern world and Lydia on the western edge of the Near Eastern world. And the Persians are marching westward and the Lydians are marching eastward. And they first meet in a kind of a pitched battle in central Anatolia, possibly at Kerkenesta or near there, the site that I showed you before, which was identified by its excavator as Pteria, the site of this big battle. Now that's uncertain, so we're not really sure about that, but that's the region where these great armies met. And the result was a kind of a draw. The Lydian army decided to go back to Lydia. The Persians pursued. There was another battle in the plain of Sardis. The Lydian army was destroyed. The Persians attacked and sacked the city, and that's how they made themselves the rulers of all of Anatolia. So the whole region was united for the first time since the late Bronze Age by the Persian conquest. And an interesting counterfactual is, what if it had gone the other way? Which it certainly could have. What if the Western peripheral Near Eastern power had prevailed over the Eastern peripheral Near Eastern power and made itself the center of the Eastern Mediterranean world, as of course Anatolia was for hundreds of years. I mean, thousands, if you want to go back to the late Roman period, but certainly during the 500-year Ottoman rule, this region was the center of a great empire. So it's not historically implausible that that could have happened in the 6th century. Of course, it didn't. So the next chapter looks at the Persian period and interesting evidence for interaction between indigenous Anatolian culture and Persian culture, attested at a number of places. And the idea is to focus in on 3. One is Lydia. The other is northwestern Anatolia, so the region around Troy. And the third is Phrygia. So here's Sardis, here's that lake we looked at before. The Bronze Age site of Kaimakcha is here. And all these yellow dots mark the locations of tumulus tombs, of large, barrows, burial mounds. And over here is a cluster that was discovered by tomb robbers. This is just to give you a sense of the landscape in the 1960s. They were arrested, but they had already sold their loot. No one knew where it was for decades until the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 1980s published an issue of its bulletin celebrating its so-called East Greek treasure. The Turkish authority, or a Turkish journalist actually found out about this, pushed it. The Turkish authorities took note. They sued the Metropolitan Museum. Negotiations went on forever and ever and ever. It was a non-jury trial. The weekend before the judge was to announce his verdict, the Turks settled on the condition that the objects the objects were repatriated to Turkey. The museum insisted that the records of how they were acquired be kept secret. So it's an interesting story. East Greek treasure, Lydian inscriptions on the East Greek treasure. I mean, they kept it secret, for decades until it had, as it were, cooled off, and then made this kind of plausible argument that, well, we can't tell from the objects themselves where they came from, and they could have come from one of these, Greek cities of Ionia. But the Lydian inscription is kind of a giveaway. They're fascinating. So here's a silver jug with a handle that looks very much like a Greek kouros. And here is a gilt silver fiale with figures that look very much like the courtiers in the Persepolis relief. It's a fascinating illustration of the kind of hybrid elite culture of this region in the Persian period. And there have been other more recent discoveries, spectacular discoveries, of objects that attest the same kind of interaction between local social elites, Greek tradition, and Persian custom. So this is the so-called Polyxena sarcophagus from near Troy. And here is a contemporary painted wooden tomb that comes from southeastern Phrygia. In all cases, these objects have come to light through the activities of grave robbers. So in no case has it been possible to excavate one of these Persian period, elite Persian period tombs in a scientific fashion. So we're going to quickly go through the other indigenous regions of Anatolia before getting to the Hellenistic period. So Licia, so this is the Lycian, the Mediterranean coast of Licia is one of the most beautiful and popular parts of Turkey with international tourists. The site of Xanthos is most famous for the Nereid monument, which was transported from Xanthos to London in the late 19th century. There has been really, really interesting research in the inland parts of Licia by German scholars participating in a long-term archaeological survey project. And another theme of the development of archaeology in this region, as in many other parts of the Mediterranean world, is the interaction between different archaeological strategies, excavation at urban sites, survey of rural sites and regions. So that's Licia. Caria is the last of these regions, and Caria is most famous for Halicarnassus, the site of Mausolus and the eponymous mausoleum. Halicarnassus, the mausoleum, and some Carian notable, probably not Mausolus, although that's how he's identified in the British Museum, but one of scores of statues that decorated the mausoleum. Mausolus, the local dynast and Persian satrap or governor buried in the mausoleum actually came from the inland site of Mylassa and moved his capital, his seat of authority, from Mylassa to Halicarnassus. And a discovery made in 2007 was of the so-called proto-mausoleum. So the tomb on the scale of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus that his administration had begun for him at Mylassa before he relocated the capital to Halicarnassus, complete with vaulted tunnel leading to sarcophagus, to chamber with pre-carved sarcophagus showing Mausolus reclining in Persian style, holding a fiali, the Persian wine drinking cup, at a kind of banquet, perhaps a funerary banquet, while his wife sits next to him, very much in the style of a matron on a Greek grave relief, making the same kind of unveiling gesture, which is a common motif in contemporary Greek art. So this is still completely off limits. I mean, I've been there. The Turkish archaeologist who's working there showed it to me, but we weren't allowed to take photographs, and proper photographs had never been published. But you can get the photographs that were in the press off of newspaper websites, which is the source of these. So then we talk about what I'm calling here the later Persian era, which is the era of conflict between the Persian Empire, of which Western Anatolia forms the western border, and Greece. And that's a conflict, this is me pointing, you can tell, pointing at Notion here, our site, on the Athenian tribute lists. And the Athenian tribute lists are these, obviously, lists of the communities in, the Greek communities in mainly in Western Asia Minor, that paid tribute to, or that were members, paid tribute to Athens, were members of the so-called Delian League, basically the Athenian Empire in the first half of the 5th century BC. So the inhabitants of this coastal region are caught between the Persian Empire here and the growing Athenian Empire here, and that's a story that we see later on in the Hellenistic period as well. That this is a border zone that is being fought over actively by an Eastern-based empire and a Western-based empire. Later on, it's the Seleucid Empire of Syria and Rome. So the Persian Empire, I mean, it ends or it's recast, really, by the conquest of Alexander the Great. And it's interesting to rethink what it was that inspired Alexander as the king of Macedon to undertake this program of conquest, but we don't have time to talk about that now. The result of of Alexander's conquest was the division of all of the Eastern Mediterranean world into a series of monarchies, and with interesting consequences for the inhabitants of the cities, which were the population centers of these monarchies, at least in the Aegean region. So all of these cities now had to be in constant negotiation with distant ruling powers for their own, for their own well-being, for their own security, for their own economic progress in relation to all their neighbors. An experience which was a relatively new one for the cities of mainland Greece, but a very familiar one for the Greek cities anyway of Western Asia Minor, who had been in a quite comparable relationship with the kings of Lydia and then with the rulers of Persia. So the Hellenistic period, this is where the book kind of gets tricky because it's pretty easy to do a sort of comprehensive look, even in a chapter at Phrygia, at Lydia, at Caria, at Licia, at the city-states of Ionia. When you start to talk about the Hellenistic period, the evidence, is much bigger, and you can't be comprehensive in the same way. So the strategy that I'm planning to adopt is to do 5 kind of, extended case studies, going back to Gordion and seeing what happened in Hellenistic Gordion, which is quite interesting because it was part of Galatia, so inhabited by these Gaulish migrants. Going back to Sardis, looking at Ephesus and the communities around Ephesus, which illustrate dramatically the precarity of the lives of the inhabitants of these communities in the early Hellenistic period, and I'll say why in a moment. And then looking at the expansion of urban life in the Meander River Valley. When you talk about the Hellenistic period in Greek history, it's often represented as the second great age of Greek colonization. And that was nowhere more intense than it was in Western Anatolia, in this particular region, the Meander River Valley, where there were more new towns founded, in close proximity to each other than any other place. So let's just go through those quickly. So human sacrifice at Gaulish Gordion. The construction of colossal temples at a number of Ionian sites in this period, and at Sardis, which after Alexander the Great reinvents itself as a Greek city. This is the region around Ephesus. So here's Ephesus and Colophon, one of the ancient cities of Ionia. The inhabitant Colophon was attacked and destroyed by the Hellenistic warlord Lysimachus in the early 3rd century, and its entire population deported to Ephesus as part of a new city foundation project. That grand undertaking was partly successful. A grid town plan was laid out, huge fortifications were built. Partly unsuccessful, Lysimachus was killed in battle, and after that, a number of the inhabitants, the deportees who had been resettled at Ephesus, apparently returned to their homelands. But the people of Colophon used this opportunity to relocate from their inland city to their coastal city, and that's Notion, where we've been doing research for the last 5 years. So this is my way of getting my own site into this book as part of illustrating, the part of this extended case study. And then there are the cities of the Meander River Valley, of which one of the most interesting is Priene, and a reason for spending a little bit of time on Priene is because it's our best known Hellenistic city anywhere, partly because it's manageable, partly because it's well preserved, and partly because it was very extensively excavated by German archaeologists at the late 19th century. So here's the view of it. And an interesting aspect of the archaeology of Priene is that the excavators dug not just the temples and the agora and so on, but extensive residential parts of town. So it's crucial to our understanding of ancient Greek household life, as well as of monumental culture. So the end of the last part of the book deals with the rise of a big local kingdom at Pergamon. So initially, all of Asia Minor is under the control of the kings of Syria. And what happens here, which is remarkable, is that a local kind of a local warlord is able to establish a foothold, and his successors turn that initially just a mountain fortress into a local kingdom, and eventually into a large territorial monarchy. Here's the site, and the book will conclude by making a comparison between Pergamon and Sardis, and between the evolution of the kingdom of Pergamon and the evolution of the kingdom of Lydia. And that's the way I try to come back to the central themes of the whole book at the end. So this is a view of Pergamon. You saw the picture before. It's this kind of mountain fastness, topographically similar to the so-called Acropolis of Sardis. The kings of Pergamon built a huge palace complex at the top of the site, and they buried their dead in enormous tumulus tombs in the plain below. So there's a kind of topographical relationship between fortress city, fertile plain, royal cemetery that has parallels in Macedonia, but also local parallels here in Anatolia. So this is a view of the altar at Pergamon in Pergamon, the altar at Pergamon in Berlin, and the final, the conclusion of the book. So I told you that the last king of Pergamon bequeathed his territory to Rome. The conclusion of the book looks back at the 1,000 years that preceded this event, and forward a little bit to the Roman period. And this is the Temple of Roman Augustus in Ankara, which is not very far. It's only about 50 kilometers from Gordion, where the story essentially begins, and it embodies, the continued complex mixture of cultural realities that were experienced then and are experienced now by the inhabitants of this region. So I already introduced this as a kind of a counterfactual, and it's fun to pursue this a little bit further and to compare the cultural history of this region with the cultural history of this region. But I'll leave it at that. So thank you. I've gone a little bit over, but